Hello everyone. I hope you've all been well despite some recent events. Speaking of unfortunate recent events, which was the entirety of 2020, what can we learn from them? Perhaps our dear friend, John Doyle, can share with us the most important lessons to take away from last year. John Doyle is a conservative content creator who makes political content regarding the current state of our affairs, which is often not really pragmatic or based in any reality. However, he has an increasingly large platform. So let's hear what he has to say about 2020 and what we can learn from it. Although, and this is a bit of a spoiler, John Doyle doesn't actually say much of anything in this video. But hey, that's enough for me, okay? Let's just sit back, relax, and watch his classy intro so we can get on to the first lesson, okay?
John Doyle in. Heck off, commie.
But moving into the list, we got 4 biggest lessons from 2020. That's what we're doing. Yeah. First of which being, we're not a serious country. Like, we're just not. We're not a serious country anymore.
Oh, hey, while I may not agree fully, I can definitely see where he's coming from with this. Our COVID response was embarrassing. The 2020 election was a disaster in terms of our sitting president perpetually trying to coup the government to stay in power. And a lot of other things that came out this year that frankly makes me embarrassed to be an American at times. Like Trump's taxes, the presidential debates, and failure to provide a stimulus to those who need it. But, let's see if our main man, John, shares that perspective.
There have been countless symptoms of this highlighted throughout the year, whether that's with the nationwide rioting, billions in property damage, all of this being dismissed as acceptable by half the country.
So the first thing he addresses here is the rioting, and I agree, the rioting was a notable thing to remember, but not because some amount of property was destroyed, but for the reasons the riots occurred. Extreme misconduct from police officers towards the POC community, which sparked protests and riots. 93% of which have been peaceful across the nation. When looking at protests, we shouldn't think of ways to curb protesting. We should think of ways to curb what the protesters are protesting about. Attacking protesters is treating the symptom, not the problem. So here is a very common rhetorical technique we'll see Mr. Doyle implement quite a bit. If you really pay attention to what he's saying here, you'll see that, well, he's not really saying anything.
Same thing with the government forcing small businesses into the ground while making exceptions for themselves and for their donors. The point basically being that we are not a serious country because we have no will to survive. We have no sense of who we are, no sense of what we're about, what we're supposed to be doing, what our purpose should be.
By using very vague and broad language, he avoids not only nuance, but possible controversy with his views, allowing his viewers to assign any type of more specific thing to his broad ideological narrative that he's spinning over American values.
We're divided by culture, class, wealth, race, language, ethnicity, religion. Like, there's simply nothing under which we can unify anymore. It just doesn't exist. This is a country that spends its time worrying about forced sexual and racial diversity. It has no greater fear than being accused of racism or an adjacent bigotry.
This is true. We are divided by all of these things. But this is not something specific to 2020 or even the United States. I would ask John Doyle, when did the country have one unifying demographic, one unifying idea? Additionally, the thing he brought up about NASA is literally just them renaming some celestial bodies that are considered a bit racist or ableist, like the Siamese Twin Galaxy or the Eskimo Nebula.
And we're supposed to believe in this like Cold War nostalgia when they assure us that China's trembling right now. China's terrified of us. No, they're not. No. China views us as a territory and people waiting to be conquered. And our leaders are deliberately weakening us and selling us out to them. That's the problem. China isn't the problem. They're trying to run the same play that they did with the USSR, with the Middle East, and now it's China's turn. So they can convince people that the biggest enemy to America is insert country here. But that's not the case. The biggest enemy to America is the people who are in charge of her. Because if it weren't China, it'd be a different country. It'd be Saudi Arabia, India, whatever. Whoever wanted to buy. And that's just it. The problem isn't that there's a demand. The problem is that our leaders are willing to provide the supply. They're willing to sell us out. And so,
I don't know if it's apparent to those of you watching, since I'm cutting up the video myself as I'm responding to it, but the way John seamlessly and honestly shamelessly flows between different talking points with no proper transition and with the topics have no relevance to one another in order to build the illusion they all play into each other somehow is at the very least impressive and also a bit scary. Anyways, these talking points all follow those vague themes that I talked about before. Let's just ask some simple questions like, who thinks China's trembling right now? And what does he mean by, our leaders are weakening us and selling us out to them? Do you mean Trump? Do you mean Pelosi? What are they doing to sell us out to them? There's so much vagueness that I honestly can't even start to respond because I don't even know what he's saying. Alright, so now he moves on to COVID-19 and the election.
A state-enforced lockdown to prevent what basically turned out to be slightly more aggressive allergies, countless livelihoods destroyed.
For COVID-19, comparing it to allergies is so not substantiated with evidence that, again, I don't even know where to start when breaking it down. To keep it simple, I'll just point out that around 300,000 people this year, and counting, have died from COVID-19 in America. The amount of men, women, and children of all allergies combined is around 150 a year. Not 150,000. 150, period. Next, he moves on to the election for a few seconds in what might be the worst offender of his vagueness. Literally anyone holding any political ideology could say this.
Plans set in motion to escalate societal indoctrination, not to mention everything that happened with our election, which we all know about.
That more or less wraps up his first lesson. The rest of it is just him ranting about an ideology that sometimes sounds like he's making up on the spot. Let's continue to his second one. So, unfortunately, almost the entirety of this lesson is him in his broad terms, saying a lot without it really meaning anything.
We have our next lesson, which is that the swamp has a check valve. This, broadly speaking, is the lesson of the Trump administration and the Trump re-election, which is that you cannot drain the swamp if, in order to drain the swamp, you need the consent of that swamp. We learned this throughout the election process. We knew that it really wasn't so much about building a case, but really it was going to come down to finding someone with integrity to hear that case. And we learned that for some reason, the establishment doesn't like Donald Trump, the anti-establishment candidate. And even throughout his administration, he was undermined consistently by the swamp, by the administrative state, people who aren't elected, people who are never up for re-election, people who literally exist to soak up tax dollars from us to compensate themselves for making the lives of average Americans more difficult. And we have never had a leader who was willing to push back against that, back against the swamp, against big tech, against big pharma, Wall Street, all of the most powerful institutions in the world that profit at the expense of the American people.
There is very little to respond to here, because, again, John Doyle has issues with being specific in his criticisms, because being specific in your critique opens yourself up to, well, critique. But when he says big, broad ideas like the swamp, or people who were elected but not appointed, what does he mean by that? Who are all of these people that are appointed but not elected who are undermining him? Who are all these people who exist just to soak up tax dollars? Unfortunately, we just don't get an answer. This is exemplified by him throwing out buzzwords like Wall Street, big tech, big pharma. Hopefully, we'll get to more substantiative points in the next lesson.
And that gets us into the next one, which is the iron law of politics. Democracy is cringe. Anybody who is defending or advocating for democracy after this year is either politically retarded or is acting maliciously.
Right, so if you're new to John Doyle's videos, and I was, and I still am, this is kind of a mask-off moment. John Doyle criticizing the very foundation off of what our country, and literally every other modern country, is built off of.
The idea that, oh, if only more people voted, all of these problems would go away. Like, you look outside, everyone has decided after listening to the screen people for 5 minutes that wearing a cloth will prevent the virus. Kneeling will heal race relations. Whatever it is, it's basically proven that you can literally do anything to people, and as long as the mainstream narrative endorses the ends, no one will care. You can destroy their livelihoods, you can beat the crap out of them, literally whatever you want, because we are no longer governed by law and order. We're not governed by justice. We are governed by social justice as defined by the narrative. There is no due process. There is no morality. There is just the mob. And
so I'm tired of John Doyle not really backing up anything he's saying. So when John Doyle is saying there is no law and order, there is no morality, there is only the mob, what he's really saying is that he's upset because his candidate lost. Also, didn't he just criticize people who were supposedly appointed, not elected in his last lesson? Does he care about democracy or not? And I assure you, back in 2016, Mr. Doyle was championing democracy.
We have to understand that this should not be a surprise to us. I mean, people are fundamentally sheep. The vast majority of people very simply lack agency. And our problem is that the people running our society use propaganda and mass mainstream media as an extension of their own power structures to keep people in line. But because they can vote, well, it's supposedly a free society.
Unfortunately, he then uses this to try to delegitimize the voices of the citizens by saying things like most people lack agency, without clarifying what he means or what he thinks should be done about that.
They'll brainwash you into what you're supposed to be thinking, but since you ultimately get to pull the lever, it's a just and free society, right? Doesn't really take into account our last election, but still. The point is that right now, half the country believes and champions exactly what every major corporation does, what the UN does, what the federal and state governments do, what the mainstream media do, And they're convinced that, well, they're actually just more educated than you, and they're smarter than you, and they're definitely not susceptible to propaganda. Not a chance. It's actually just that they're smarter than you.
He goes on and on about how the media is somehow brainwashing us to vote a certain way, but couldn't, by his criticisms, we say the same thing about Trump brainwashing his voters to vote for him? I don't know why Doyle's criticism of influence starts and ends in mainstream media. Doyle's frankly alarming criticism of democracy and his other authoritarian dog whistles only lead us to ask one clarifying question. What's the alternative? If not democracy, what else? I assure you his answer won't be very specific or comfortable. Finally, let's move on to his fourth lesson.
And speaking of you, my friend, we get into the last one, which is, very bluntly, no one will save you. That is the truth. And if you don't get it by now, then you better get it pretty soon, because no one is coming to save you, and no one is coming to save us. We're the last shot. There is no future generations figuring it out. There is no fail-safe.
Something me and him agree on. This is the same way people on the left feel about issues as well, especially things like climate change. No one is going to save us, so we have to direct the action ourselves. We have to go out, take action, volunteer, canvass, phone bank. Let's see if Doyle has a similar approach. Although a subtle feeling in the back of my mind says maybe not.
It's people like us that are going to be screwed over by this. And I implore you not to get depressed about this, but instead to get really pissed off about this. I want you to get angry. Getting sad is for losers. A dog dying is a tragedy, but our country being sold out by those who are supposed to be looking out for us is an outrage. And I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to sell you a false hope. There are not many trends right now that suggest that things are going to get better. There just aren't. The society is engineered to breed mental illness, to crush the American spirit, the American dream, the hopes of normal people, to get normal jobs, have families, live normal lives. All of that is made increasingly difficult by the people in charge of our country, and it is breeding mental illness, because if you have a population that is mentally ill, that is desperate for any sort of meaning in their lives, you can mobilize that population with propaganda to keep any resistance in check. And that's what's happening to us right now, and they want you to join them. Oh yeah, they want to make America such a degenerate, immoral circus of a country that it's impossible for you to take any pride in it anymore. They want you to just give up, ride the decline, chase short-term gratification in the form of consumerism, sugar, mass media, pornography, drugs, alcohol, any vice of your choosing, and they'll tell you that's what makes America great, that you have the freedom to choose your preferred method of self-destruction. And as a result, we conservatives, let alone Americans, conservatives are so demoralized and brainwashed, even we don't know what we're fighting for anymore. We want to make America great again, but we're losing the memory and idea of what that even means, and that's by design.
I'm actually pretty disappointed. I thought he was actually going to say something. I'm very disappointed in you, Mr. Doyle. But no, he's just using his closing lesson to fearmonger, throwing up more buzzwords like morality, degenerate, a circus of a country, the American spirit, the American dream, hope. I could go on.
Like just last week, MasterCard and Visa cut ties with Pornhub, and resultantly Pornhub deletes like the majority of its content. This was literally the greatest dub that the right has taken in the 21st century so far. But even then, we're too brainwashed and confused to recognize that.
So now he randomly throws up the Pornhub controversy with MasterCard and Visa, where Pornhub was forced to delete tens of thousands of videos off their site, and declares it a dub for the right, when really this is a dub for everyone, is it not? I mean, no one wanted child porn on Pornhub or videos where they couldn't verify age or consent.
The utter state that we are in. Literal credit card companies, I repeat, literal credit card companies end up being some of the most based, inadvertently based entities in 2020. And again, this is not to demoralize you. If you want to be demoralized, go watch the news, go watch Instagram, attend a college lecture. I don't know. I don't want you demoralized. I want you to get angry. I want you to come out of this not depressed, not like this doughy mass of flesh, 2 parts sugar, 1 part alcohol, 1 part marijuana, 3 parts pornography addiction. I want you to come out of this carved out of wood. I want you to be a juggernaut, because you cannot expect to return to a strong moral country if you yourself aren't emulating the caliber of man required to cultivate and sustain that country. It's impossible.
Right. So now we get his main call to action. His main call to action isn't to vote. It's not to go on canvas and change minds. It's not to go phone bank and get a high turnout for local elections. It isn't to get involved in it anyway, actually. It's to get angry. I don't really understand what that's going to affect, and to be honest, that's probably why Mr. Doyle won't get what he wants out of political candidates, because this is how he manifests his views. Just getting angry, I guess. I don't really understand the motive.
It's not a coincidence that society deteriorates as men become weaker, including in terms of spirit and willpower. And if you think that the average American man would have been in a place to fight in the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, even attending that, let alone just grow up and survive in the generation immediately preceding his own, you're misaligned with reality, and that's the problem. Men thought that they could become weak, and now we're surprised to see that society's on fire. This would surprise virtually no one at any point in history, but we're stupid now, and so we think that we can just conquer and evolve past nature, but we can't. And we're suffering the consequences of that, having tried. And if we don't better ourselves, then we can expect to basically just stay here. I mean, we can't expect to build a better country. To suggest otherwise is ridiculous, and to suggest that there is a more immediately obvious and practical solution forward is also ridiculous.
And finally, he wraps it up with the weak men narrative, suggesting it's a problem that men are, like, physically capable of fighting in the Revolutionary War in 1776. I mean, I guess obesity is a pretty big problem if that's what he's talking about. I don't really understand why he tried to tie that into his overall narrative. So, with the end of Lesson 4, that about wraps up John Doyle's video. I think it's really unsettling to take a look at the rhetorical techniques Mr. Doyle uses, shamelessly intertwining things together that have no relation or even correlation to each other, to spin a narrative, saying a lot but not saying a lot at the same time, by using dog whistles and a lack of respect for our democratic institutions because his feelings got hurt this year. And, you know, if he ever wants to have a discussion about his more specific policy positions or what his alternative to democracy is, or anything else, you know, I would be more than happy to, but something tells me he doesn't want that type of specific conversation. You know, just for fun, I actually reached out to him through email, and at the time of the video going up, he hasn't responded yet, so, you know, we'll see. Personally, I look forward to finding out his actual, concrete policy positions. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time, have a good one.